Good evening there in Moscow. I am Marjorie Spruill. I am Professor Emerita from University of South Carolina. I am very pleased to be invited by the American Center in Moscow to make this address on the eve of Women's Equality Day in the United States. Really pleased that you are interested in learning about this interesting chapter of U.S. history, the efforts of American women to gain the vote. I may be biased since I've spent about half of my career working on this. I recently published a new edition of my book, One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement, and several other books about this, including New Women of the New South. But I think it's a pretty interesting story, and we'll try to make it interesting to you. Women of the United States gained the right to vote almost a century and a half after the nation was founded, and they gained it through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified, as you can see, on August 26, 1920. Just 3 years ago, we celebrated this tremendous milestone, commemorating the centennial in the middle of a turbulent presidential election, as well as a pandemic. Gaining this amendment took many years and a lot of hard work by several generations of suffragists whose work we're honoring now. Some of the suffragists who fought the hardest for this victory did not live to see it, including the most famous of them, Susan B. Anthony, who died in 1906. Late in life, in 1894, she observed, as you see on the screen, "We shall someday be heated, and when we shall have our amendment to the Constitution of the United States, everybody will think it was always so, just exactly as many young people think that all privileges, all freedom, always were hers. They have no idea how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past." Anthony was right. Most Americans have little idea of just how hard it was for women in this country to gain the vote. Nor do they realize that the U.S. was hardly in the forefront in the granting of the vote to women. People in the U.S. take great pride in the fact that our nation was a leader in the establishment of the Republican form of government, where citizens are self-governed and elect our own leaders. But many nations were well ahead of the U.S. when it came to granting the vote to women. Russia, as you probably know, preceded the U.S. by 3 years. I was just reading about this the other day, that Russian women won the right to vote and to run for office in July of 1917, following the largest demonstration by women in Russian history and attended by around 40,000 women. The date usually given for the start of the American women's suffrage movement is 1848. In that year, several hundred women and a few men came together in the small town of Seneca Falls, New York, to talk about women's rights and to issue a public call for votes for women. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was later a figure in this, who's the great general of the American suffrage movement at its end, who was also president of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. She considered this to be the beginning of the International Women's Suffrage Movement. The suffrage movement in the United States took so long partly because of our federal system of government, in which many decisions are made by the states. As the founding fathers came together to establish a constitution, they left the issue of deciding who could vote to the states. So while suffrage advocates in many nations had one parliament or one assembly to convince, suffragists in the United States had to fight the battle over and over again in the many states that comprised the Union. The 15 states gave women the vote before 1920, and several more granted partial voting rights, such as the right to vote for president or in primary elections. Many states outright refused to grant women the vote. And therefore, the full enfranchisement of women ultimately came down to securing an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, one that declared that no citizen could be, quote, denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So this was hard. The Founding Fathers deliberately made it hard to change the Constitution. They intended it to be a flexible document, but they also intended to prevent any revisions or additions that lacked strong support and from across the nation. So to succeed, an amendment has to have the approval of 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the state. So by design, no idea that's considered radical by most Americans can be added to the nation's founding document, and no proposal that lacked support throughout the nation will be able to succeed. So that explains why the story that I'll be telling you today is about a movement that was started in one section of the United States by a small group of women considered to be radicals, and somehow gained the overwhelming widespread support that was necessary to overcome these obstacles that are deliberately placed in the path. Of course, in addition to the constitutional and political obstacles that stood in their way, women who sought the vote had to change ideas about women, because those people considered women to be unsuitable as voters. They were not only irrational, but thought to be too emotional. The people in the early 19th century were increasingly speaking of women as more moral and religious than men, which is not the case in previous centuries. But still, this was turned against women. Women, people said, mustn't be exposed to the sordid world of politics and thus corrupted. They should stay in the home where they could be protected. When the demand for woman suffrage was first made in 1848, it was part of a women's movement that focused on changing women's status, not just in relation to politics. The movement actually began as a result of women's participation in a wave of reform movements, especially temperance and abolition, that swept the United States in the years leading up to the Civil War. But there was a powerful reaction against women's participation, even from the relatively progressive men who were the abolitionists. But women fought for the right to participate. Gradually, many of these women also came to fight for their own rights. One argument that they used, one that would be used throughout the century and throughout the movement, was that if women were by nature more moral and religious than men, their participation outside the home and in government would be beneficial. Among the earliest such women were some of my favorite characters in this story: Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the Grimke sisters of Charleston, South Carolina, where I now live, who came from a prominent slaveholding family, and they left their privileged upbringing and their luxuries to go and live in an austere fashion among Quakers in the North. And they did this because of their abhorrence for slavery. They went further. They began traveling as agents of anti-slavery organizations and speaking out in public, including in front of audiences that included men. This was regarded as scandalous, even by men within their own movement who were afraid the controversy would hurt their cause. I mean, it was really bad. At one point, a hall where Angelina was speaking was attacked by a mob who then tore it apart, the room, the building, and burned it to the ground. Both of the sisters wrote about women's rights. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a big fan of the Grimkes, quoting Sarah in Ginsburg's first Supreme Court appearance ever in Frontiero versus Michigan, saying, "I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright." The women who set this movement in action, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, also ran into difficulties participating in the anti-slavery movement. The two women first met in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, only to find that women were excluded from the proceedings, told they had to sit behind a curtain if they wished to know what was going on. In 1848, they organized this now iconic conference, the Seneca Falls Convention, that many people refer to as this beginning of the women's suffrage movement, as I said, in this country and abroad. There, the participants adopted what was called the Declaration of Sentiments and demanded a wide range of reforms. In fact, suffrage was just one of many issues discussed, and it was considered so controversial that only powerful urging by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the former slave and famous anti-slavery orator Frederick Douglass convinced them to include it. And once they did include the demand for the vote, many participants refused to sign. It was so scandalous at the time that, in fact, anticipating this, Stanton's husband, Henry, a guy with political ambitions, had actually cleared out of this town beforehand so he could make it clear that he was not involved. Other women who became prominent leaders of the women's movement early in its history, including Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, were not at Seneca Falls, but they very quickly joined this cause. Black women, as well as white women, were active in the women's movement in these years. As the women's movement took off in the 1850s, in fact, it was an interracial movement. Sojourner Truth, who had escaped from slavery in New York, became one of the star orators of the women's rights as well as the anti-slavery movement. Unlike Truth, most of the African American women active in the women's movement in these years were middle-class women who had been born free in the North, including Sarah Remond, daughter of a prominent family in Salem, Massachusetts, and Harriet Fortin Purvis and Margaretta Fortin of Philadelphia, and Frances Harper, a noted abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer. The early women's rights movement, however, was clearly a regional movement. In the years before the Civil War, these women's rights advocates held annual conventions throughout the North and the Midwest. But in the South, white people disdained the movement as a spinoff of the anti-slavery movement. The Grimkes, in fact, were warned never to return to the South, and their writings were burned outside the post office in Charleston. During the war, women's rights advocates chose to put aside advocacy of their own rights and to work exclusively for the freedom of the enslaved. Working through the National Women's Loyal League, they sought to persuade Congress and President Lincoln to make the war a war of liberation, to adopt a 13th Amendment to the Constitution that would end slavery everywhere in the United States forever. When the war ended, the women's movement began to focus more and more on gaining the vote. Women involved in this early women's movement believed in universal suffrage for all, not just for white women, a point that many people do not realize. Many of the most progressive men in the anti-slavery movement worked with them, including Frederick Douglass. But these women were really upset, very, very disappointed, when after the war, the Republicans who controlled Congress pushed through constitutional amendments, the 14th and the 15th, to protect and enfranchise newly freed African Americans, which they were very happy about. However, it stated that this protection of voting rights would apply only to male citizens. In fact, inserting the word male in the U.S. Constitution for the first time ever. Because racial prejudice was strong in the North as well as in the West, and as, of course, in the South, it was going to be hard, they knew, to get the requisite number of states, 3/4, to extend the vote to Black men, to ratify these. Adding women's suffrage, most of these men, including the former abolitionists, concluded, would make that impossible. Even Frederick Douglass begged the suffragists to understand. It was, they said, the Negro's hour. The woman's hour, they said, would soon come. The issue of how to respond to this tore the women's movement apart. In 1869, the movement divided into two factions over whether to support ratification of the 15th Amendment and how to go about winning the vote for women, with the National refusing to support ratification, the Americans supporting it, but with Lucy Stone saying at least that way somebody would get out of this terrible pit of not having the vote. This schism would go on for 20 years. And during that time, both sides were trying various approaches to winning the vote. They knew there was little support at the time for a federal woman suffrage amendment, so the American set out to cultivate grassroots support. They tried to persuade the public that women's suffrage was not a radical proposal, but one that was consistent with widely shared American values. They formed state-level organizations, and they tried to educate the public on the suffrage issue and win state suffrage amendments. On the other hand, Anthony and Stanton and the National could not bear the idea of going across the United States begging men for rights that they thought ought to be theirs already as American citizens. And in this period of bitter disappointment, when they were being discouraged by their former male allies from even working for women's rights, they both made racist statements decrying that women like themselves, educated and well qualified, would be governed by former slaves, statements that caused many in the United States to oppose the celebration of the suffrage centennial, or at least to honor certain suffragists. In the early 1870s, suffragists in the national woman suffrage movement tried a new approach, demanding suffrage through the federal courts. The idea they had was to go out and engage in civil disobedience by voting, to be voting illegally and arrested and tried and defend themselves by insisting that this newly adopted 14th Amendment actually protected the voting rights of all citizens, including women, never mind that pesky second clause that had the word male in it. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, hoping to become the test case for the strategy, was arrested and indicted for, I love the wording here, quote, knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting for a representative of the Congress of the United States, unquote. Her case did not make it all the way to the Supreme Court as she hoped, but another suffragist, Virginia Minor, was able to get it before the court. But the court then ruled unanimously that citizenship did not automatically confer the right to vote. The 14th Amendment did not prevent any state from excluding women. And so that meant that women would have to go out and beg men in every state across the nation to franchise women, with the final goal of getting enough states to be states where politicians would have to answer to women voters, and then they could expect that these men would vote in Congress for the federal amendment and in the states for ratification. But that would take another half century. Later, after the 1920 victory, the suffragists added all up and found that between the Civil War and the victory of the 19th Amendment, that they had been forced to conduct, as you see here, hundreds of campaigns. That there would be no immediate rescue through federal action, and that women must take on this hard task of going across the country, begging men in each state to grant the vote, was a daunting prospect. But at that time, there were suddenly some signs that this was possible. And these came from a very unexpected source, the wild and woolly West, as people called it. To everyone's surprise, politicians in several Western states not only enfranchised women, but at times actually fought Congress for the right to do so. In 1869, Wyoming, still a territory, led the nation in the adoption of women's suffrage when leading men of the territory, inspired by this tough frontier woman, Esther Morris, had urged them to do that. She had attended some of the pre-war women's conventions back east and brought those ideas to the West. Even more surprising was that the Mormon stronghold of Utah, again, still a territory, was among the first parts of the United States to grant women's suffrage. Shown here is the Mormon president of the Utah Territory Women's Suffrage Association. And like other women, Mormon women, there was a, quote, plural wife. They had polygamy, as you know. Colorado and Idaho were among the other pioneering suffrage states. These women were organized into an organization, the Rocky Mountain Women's Suffrage Association. You see them posing here with Anthony. Were justly proud of their region, because remember, at that time, this was the only place in the world where women could vote. Now, historians disagree about why exactly the West was so precocious in its adoption of women's suffrage, but most stress practical politics. In each case, for one reason or another, politicians found it expedient, or that means beneficial, to enfranchise women. In Wyoming, the leading men of the sparsely populated territory thought that enfranchising women would actually attract national attention, be used almost as an effective marketing gimmick, and that perhaps it would attract women to move out there. Plus, they hoped that women would come and help to civilize the place, meaning to build schools and churches, and of course, have children and build the population. Meanwhile, in Utah, Mormons hoped that enfranchising women would help convince Easterners, including congressmen, that Mormon women were not downtrodden slaves despite polygamy, and thus and also helping to enfranchising women would tend to shift the balance of power in their favor in the power struggle that was ongoing with non-Mormons in Utah, meaning miners and cowboys and prospectors and railroad construction workers. In other words, people who tended not to have women with them. These Western victories definitely picked up the sagging spirits of suffragists nationwide, but it also taught them one of the most important lessons they would ever learn. Politicians might not be won over by arguments for the justice of women's suffrage, but they could be won over if suffragists could show them some reason that they would benefit from giving women the vote. In other words, that an expediency argument would always be necessary. These 4 victories were important for many reasons. In the long slog toward the federal amendment, every gain, every state would be important. And as more and more of them went for women's suffrage, then their congressmen and senators and state legislators would be supportive. It also made it clear that the women's suffrage movement had support outside the Northeast, and it was no longer just a cause of the radicals associated with anti-slavery. Another major step forward for the movement came when the Women's Christian Temperance Movement converted to the cause because of its president, Frances Willard, bringing with her hundreds of conservative Christian women into the movement. Women frustrated that politicians seemed not to be listening to them, but only to the liquor industry. And they believed that working for women's suffrage, in fact, was not radical, but it was their Christian duty. The WCT had chapters in every American community in those days, as well as 21 other nations. And in fact, it played a major role in women winning the vote in New Zealand in the 1890s, which was the first nation to enfranchise women. So by 1890, things were looking up for the movement, even though they still only had a few states. And it entered a new era as the leaders put aside those old rivalries and joined into one organization, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which I shall refer to as the National. Under Anthony's command, The movement began to grow in terms of size and influence, still had that goal of the federal amendment, but they recognized they had to continue to get more state victories all over to become a truly national victory. And their biggest problem was the South, the region of the country where the movement would always meet the most resistance and the least success. During the centennial, I published an article about the South that I entitled Nemesis, a word which in English means a bitter enemy that works furiously to oppose you and won't give up. And that's exactly the role that the South played. Yet as a leader from Kentucky, Laura Clay, warned that national leaders, you can work for 50 years and get nowhere unless you bring in the South. The key issue was race and racism. In the South, the white Southern men who were in control of politics already hated the suffrage movement as a spinoff of the abolitionist movement. Now they were trying to regain control over politics completely. They regarded the 15th Amendment as unconstitutional, saying it had been forced on them during Reconstruction. They were trying to figure out how to keep Black men from voting without violating the 14th Amendment and 15th and being punished by Congress by having their number of representatives in Congress cut back. The white suffragists tried to convince them that they don't take the vote away from Black men and risk that. Instead, just adopt women's suffrage, arguing there are more white women in the South than in the North than Black women, so that will guarantee white supremacy. This policy, repulsive as it is, still did not work. As one Mississippi politician said, Southern men refused to cower behind petticoats and use lovely womanhood to maintain white supremacy, unquote. Instead, they found other ways to maintain white political supremacy, including ones that would be around for a long time: poll taxes, taxes on voting that made voting too expensive for most Black men and many poor whites, literacy tests, understanding tests, and which they were required to explain the meaning of a part of the Constitution or any other questions put to them by white registrars who would then just declare that they had failed and turn them away. But Congress and the Supreme Court let them get away with it then and for another half century. For the rest of the suffrage movement, the South would continue to be a problem. The interracial quality of the original suffrage movement was virtually lost. Some of the older suffragists who had fought against slavery had now died, and younger women were coming into the movement. Some interracial friendships, such as those involving Anthony, survived. Others did not. White suffragists were not alike, however, on race. There was variety among them, as needs to be recognized. Some were extreme racists who opposed Blacks ever voting, some of them especially from the far deep South. Others thought literacy tests were okay since the nation had public schools and in times Blacks would learn to read and this problem would go away. Others hated to compromise their values, but they did so anyway, knowing that at this period in American history, their movement was never going to succeed if suffrage leaders and organizations openly advocating for equal suffrage for African Americans. This was a strange parallel to what had happened after the Civil War, when supporters of African American suffrage believed that they had no chance of victory if women were included. For years thereafter, white Southern congressmen would continue to block the amendment, but suffragists had to have votes from at least some of them. So white women in the South were excluding African Americans from white suffrage groups and trying to distance their movement from the rights of African Americans. Despite all of this and their disappointment with so many white women, African American women saw this as their cause too. They continued to support the suffrage movement, mostly working through African American women's clubs or suffrage clubs. This was not only a white movement. Prominent African American suffragists such as Ida B. Wells Barnett became internationally famous as a crusader against lynching, was one of the founders of the NAACP, was one of the most prominent American women suffragists. And Mary Church Terrell, the first president and founder of the National Association of Colored Women, also a founder of the NAACP, was someone who worked to build support for suffrage among African Americans. She was a well-educated woman who had studied in Europe, was fluent in several languages, and sometimes represented American suffragists at international conferences. Adela Hunt Logan, a faculty member at Tuskegee in Alabama, one of the few Black women in the South who was able to openly support women's suffrage, but not allowed into white suffragist organizations. She insisted that if white women needed the vote to protect their rights, then Black women, who were the victims of racism as well as sexism, needed the ballot even more. Nonetheless, white suffrage leaders who either shared that nativism or racism endemic to the turn of the century America, or who reluctantly concluded that they needed to cater to it in order to succeed, continued in their attempts to shed the movement's radical image and enlarge their constituency. So as we go into the 20th century, the movement seemed stalled. Anthony had retired, then soon died, a martyr to the cause. And the woman in charge in most of these years in the early 19th century was Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, a great orator, a medical doctor, as well as a licensed minister. She was not an effective leader, however, and there were no more state victories. But a new reform movement was sweeping the nation that was to have a major positive impact on the suffrage movement and contribute greatly to the victory because of its impact on motivating women to become suffragists and motivating men to support them. It also provided what this floundering movement badly needed, which was a new and effective expediency argument. By 1910, the progressive movement had begun around 1900 at the grassroots level, swept national politics, was proving to be a huge help to the cause. We associate it with both parties, Republican President Teddy Roosevelt and Democratic President Woodrow Wilson. Progressives in both parties wanted to see stronger, honest government that would act boldly to address major problems. They wanted reforms to clean up city, state, and national politics and protect the health and safety of citizens. All over the nation, including the South, the women's suffrage movement drew support from men and women who supported these reforms, including abolishing child labor, protecting women workers, endorsing public health programs, and legislation that would curb political corruption. This cartoon, kind of blurry, shows corrupt politicians fleeing as Madam enters the world of politics with her broom. One thing that was remarkable was how the goals of the movement fit perfectly with prevailing ideas about woman's nature. Though by this time women had advanced in education and worked outside the home, most women remained in the home, and ideas about woman's nature remained surprisingly unchanged. But progressives believed that women tended to be nurturing, compassionate, and honest, and that would mean they would vote for stronger, more compassionate government that would enact progressive reforms. In fact, I argue in my book, When Woman Would Vote, that women eventually won the vote, not so much because people's ideas about women's nature changed, but because Americans were changing their ideas about the nature and purpose of government and wanting government to be more proactive, protective, compassionate, and moral. But just as the endorsement of the women's Christian temperance movement had made the liquor industry fear and oppose women's suffrage, the idea that women would support reforms, including cleaning up politics, provoked a lot of opposition from businessmen and politicians who stood to lose from progressive reform. Around 1912, the movement really began to take off. Increased support for suffrage resulting from the progressive movement, and a new series of victories coming from Western states. State victories beginning in Washington State, in California, Oregon, Kansas, Arizona, seemed to breathe new life into suffragists all over the country. The National still faced significant opposition in the Northeast, including the powerful states of New York and New Jersey with huge numbers of members in Congress, and there was no progress in the South. Most high-ranking suffragists thought they had not yet reached that point where they could stop working in the states and just focus on Congress. But some suffragists started to get impatient, saying, let's just drop all this state work and go for getting a federal amendment. And this was the point of view of the leader of those who became known as the militant suffragists in the U.S., led by this young woman named Alice Paul. Paul had been influenced by militant suffragists that she had met while a political science graduate student studying in London. And when 1910 returned to the United States, bringing these ideas with her, she admired greatly the militant spirit of the, quote, suffragettes, the name for the Women's Social and Political Union, the relatively radical British suffragists. In the U.S., by the way, suffragists did not use that term suffragettes. It was only used by the anti-suffragists to belittle them. And I've been on a personal quest to try to get people here from referring to American suffragists as suffragettes, since they did not embrace that term. Paul demonstrated with them, went to jail with them. She first worked with the National, including organizing this spectacular suffrage march in Washington, D.C., down Pennsylvania Avenue on the eve of Wilson's inauguration. 8,000 peaceful demonstrators, got tremendous press attention, but unfortunately, men in the crowd, many of them drunk, many of them hostile to the movement, attacked the marchers, had to be rescued by the cavalry, no less, as the police stood by and did nothing. But to Paul's delight, this led to increased sympathy for the movement, especially with members of Congress whose wives, sisters, and daughters had been marching for the right to vote. By 1940, there was another major schism in the movement's ranks as the militants broke with the National. Alice Paul and her followers formed the National Woman's Party. It infuriated Carrie Chapman Catt and the national leaders when the National Woman's Party picketed the White House, something decidedly uncommon in those days and certainly shocking when it was done by women. The most shocking thing, of course, was continuing to picket the White House even after the U.S. entered World War I. Criticism of the president and the government was made illegal and not tolerated. As Wilson spoke of a war to end democracy, they tried to embarrass him before the world, including reminding him of how many other nations had already given women the vote. You see here their most inflammatory act was when they compared him to the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, the enemy. It called him Kaiser Wilson. The Wilson administration eventually jailed many of them at the dreaded workhouse, Occoquan Workhouse near D.C., which is now a historic site. Some, including Paul, went on hunger strikes and were forcibly fed. Finally, the word leaked out, and the outcry from the public forced the Wilson administration to back down and release them, gaining valuable publicity and considerable sympathy for Paul and her followers. Meanwhile, the National continued its work with their talented strategic leader, Carrie Chapman Catt. Having returned to the national presidency in 1915, this skillful general immediately launched her so-called winning plan, coordinating efforts across the nation, working to gain Wilson support, and running a massive lobbying effort before Congress. Hoping to gain Wilson's support, she put aside her own pacifism and urged suffragists to throw themselves as visibly as possible into war work. The organization even funded a women's overseas hospital in France, and this was the first contingent of nurses who worked there in the line of fire. The support of suffragists for the war effort enhanced the patriotic image of the movement with the public and powerful decision makers, and certainly Wilson. And he finally endorsed the federal amendment. It was a huge victory. In 1918, he addressed Congress, asking them to enfranchise women in recognition of their war service. They still had to win over a few more senators as that opposition from the South continued. It was very hard, especially after the pandemic of 1918 struck. And as in more recent times, public health officials banned large gatherings of people. You could not go door to door campaigning. You could not travel. But somehow they were able to defeat a few congressional enemies and elect a few friends, which meant that finally, in June 1919, Congress approved the amendment by the required two-thirds vote in the Senate and House. The joint resolution was signed, and the proposed amendment was sent to the states for ratification. However, it was still not over. After Congress approved the federal amendment, it still had to be ratified, as you remember, by 36 states before it could become law. And as Paul sewed stars on the suffrage flag one by one as states ratified, the struggle continued. Illinois and Wisconsin competing for the honor of being the first to ratify, while Georgia and Alabama scrambled to be the first to pass a rejection resolution denouncing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, they called it, as unwarranted, unnecessary, and downright dangerous. Many Southern state legislators vowed to fight it till the end as an incursion into the rights of states, insisting that the 19th Amendment was nothing more than an extension of the 15th, and that approval of the 19th would signify that they had accepted the 15th, which no true son or daughter of the South, they said, could possibly do. But finally, in the summer of 1920, with just one more state needed, President Wilson, eager for his party to be on the right side when you doubled the electorate, pressed Democratic governors to call special sessions so states controlled by Democrats could get credit for the victory. Governor Roberts of Tennessee complied, and thus this final battle over women's suffrage took place in Nashville in the long, hot summer of 1920, a final dramatic contest where anti-suffragists and suffragists from all over the country descended on the state in a bitter struggle over ideology and influence. At first, it seemed that suffragists had all the support they needed, but the suffragists watched with dismay as men pledged to support ratification mysteriously switched sides, and they were very uncertain of the result when the vote finally took place. But on August 18th, Tennessee ratified a decision made possible by a 24-year-old legislator from the mountains, Harry Byrne, changing his vote at the assistance of his elderly mother. Needless to say, there's a statue of them both erected in Tennessee during the centennial. Still, aunties didn't give up. They used parliamentary tricks to delay it, but finally, supporters managed to affirm the vote, and the amendment was rushed by train to D.C., where the Secretary of State was gotten up in the middle of the night to sign it before any kind of injunction or other delay, legal delay, could ensue. So finally, on August 26, 1920, the federal amendment to this that the suffragists had fought for so long became the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. In conclusion, the suffrage movement was long and arduous. It is no wonder that suffragists felt exhausted as well as elated upon realizing their victory. The movement changed over time in response to changes in American society and politics, and its history, thus, is complex and fascinating. The movement exhausted several generations of leaders who devised and revised strategies that fit the changing times. The suffrage story includes both a record of harmony and cooperation between diverse groups of suffragists and a disturbing record of discrimination and betrayal, of racism and of nativism, mixed with idealism, persistence, and courage. The adoption of the 19th Amendment, we always point out, was not a complete victory, however, as many women remained without the vote. It's important to understand that all American women who were citizens were enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. But in 1920, not all of them would be allowed to use that new right. Outside the South, African American women were voting, very actively involved in politics. But most Black women at that time still lived within the Southern states, and they were prevented from voting by the same barriers that had been constructed to keep Black men from voting. In fact, a major goal of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was to remove those barriers. And again, many women and men, such as the great Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi, endured jail and beatings in order to gain that right. The goal of universal suffrage for all, regardless of race or sex, was largely accomplished at last through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally enforced both the 15th and the 19th Amendments. Before the Voting Rights Act of 65, only about 23% of African Americans of voting age were registered across the nation, but just 4 years later, 61% had registered, and those numbers climbed. Since then, African American women have proven to be the nation's most devoted voters, turning out to vote in large numbers at every election. The Voting Rights Act was later renewed and expanded under several administrations from both parties. But in 2013, unfortunately, our Supreme Court ruled part of the bill unconstitutional, greatly weakening it, which has led to a renewal of voter suppression in some states. Once again, Americans have realized that efforts to protect voting rights are necessary. And to keep a healthy democracy, there will always be a struggle to preserve those rights. It seems as though voting rights are difficult to gain, but once gained, must be protected and defended. Perhaps the suffrage movement is not over. Still, the adoption of the 19th Amendment was a major breakthrough, enfranchising most women and giving others, including African American women whose rights were being denied them, the right that was later claimed. So each year, around August 26, Americans pay tribute to the suffragists, and well, we should. For as the story makes clear, in 1920, the vote was not given to American women, as is sometimes said even by me. They fought for it against great odds and for many years. As Anthony said, American women should remember that every single inch of ground that we stand upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past. And on election day, many voters, especially women, honor her by putting their I voted stickers as well as flowers on her grave. We should study the movement, the parts we admire and the parts we deplore, and make certain that we continue to strive for voting rights for all. But it seems to me that this annual celebration of Women's Equality Day is important and inspiring, honoring the achievement of all these women who clearly believed that voting was a right worth great sacrifice. I want to thank the American Center in Moscow for this invitation, and now with what time we have to ask, to invite your questions, which you can, I understand, enter on the chat. There's a question, what are you currently working on? Are there new books or projects we should be looking forward to? Thank you for that question. I have continued to work on the suffrage movement in recent years, although the other half of my career, I have, in the more recent one, I have worked on the more recent period. I wrote a book called Divided We Stand. Here, I'll just grab a copy to show you. Divided We Stand, the battle over women's rights and family values that polarized American politics. And I would urge you to look at that. It describes the rise of the women's rights movement in the late 60s, early 70s to a peak period of success, where many, many changes were made that changed life in this country for women, and certainly that I, as a young woman at the time, benefited from. And then the rise of a conservative women's movement in opposition to certain parts of those gains. And that movement became more powerful. And I argue that the sort of competition between these two movements got lots more American women to vote and to be participants in politics actively. And it also had a major impact on the polarization of the country, as American women don't all use their vote or engage in politics for the same goals. They can have very different ideas about what's best for women and for the nation. And it made a huge difference in our politics, as around 1980, the two political parties essentially chose up sides between these two movements, a tendency that has only continued to this day. So those are the two main things that I write and talk about. Basically, anything having to do with women politics, ideas about women in politics, the South, the role of white supremacy in this movement, etc. Are there other questions? Let me scroll down here. Does anybody else have questions? Are there lessons from the suffrage movement that can be applied to modern struggles for gender equality? Yes, definitely. You may have heard a few years ago when Elizabeth Warren, a senator from Massachusetts, was trying to raise a point in Senate and being shouted down, sort of the leader of the Republicans, Mitch McConnell, said, I tried to warn her, but she persisted. And that term, she persisted, has become a real phrase adopted by women's rights advocates. And it is certainly a very pertinent one. And I guess the main lesson, to answer your question, is persist. Don't ever give up. Keep working for what you think ought to happen. And the one thing that is very different today is that rather than women's rights advocates being divided according to race, there is a great deal more unity among women's rights advocates in the modern era, which gives it much more strength. This is a period of time in which there's tremendous controversy, as I'm sure you have heard, about the abortion issue. And this is one that women play a very important role on both sides of that debate. Actually, the movement to try to roll back reproductive freedom that was gained through Roe v. Wade was one that was led by conservative women such as Phyllis Schlafly, the late Phyllis Schlafly. And it's an issue that for conservative women, particularly evangelical Christians and Catholics, has been one of the most important reasons that they go into politics. And the Republican Party originally in the early 1970s, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans all sort of as a party took the same line on abortion and reproductive rights. There were people in each party that held views pro and con. But after 1980, that was the Republican Party, at the insistence of conservative women, began to take the position that they were a human life party, and to make opposition to abortion a litmus test for appointing judges and that sort of thing, which a strategy which, of course, has now resulted in the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So the lessons from the suffrage movement, I would say, is just keep fighting. Susan B. Anthony, as you saw, was very disappointed that in her lifetime she did not see a victory, but her comment was, victory is failure is impossible. How did my academic journey shape my approach to studying and understanding American history? Well, I suppose very directly, because I'm 72, and I was born in 1951. And so I actually experienced a lot of the history that I write about now. And part of that was because the opportunities for women and the things that were being taught in schools and colleges were just beginning to change during the time that I was in high school and college. And it was, things had opened up just enough that I was attending the university. I was admitted to the University of North Carolina as a freshman, and they were only 250 of us women and 2,500 men, because it had traditionally been a university for men. And they didn't even, when they finally did start letting women in, it was only as largely as junior transfers. And so that was rare. Women's history was just starting to be taught. I took the first course in it that was ever offered there at the university. When I went on to graduate school, there were a few scholars across the country and in Europe that were starting to write about women's history, but there were no formal courses on it. So I actually was amongst one of the first to really start to teach women's history, which I've done for my whole career. There's hardly been a semester when I wasn't teaching about it, for at least for the last couple of decades. And so, in each time you adjust what you're covering, because I like for my American history classes to go all the way up to the present. So I always have to sort of shrink what it was I was going to talk about in order to make room for whatever happened during those few months before the end of the course. And so I guess the answer to your question, how did my academic journey shape my approach? I think, obviously, I wasn't around for the suffrage movement, as old as I am, but for at least the part of my career in which I've written about the modern era, part of it comes, I think there's a good deal to be gained from understanding it, from experiencing it. However, you have to strive to not let your own personal views and political views blind you to what's going on around you. And in my book, Divided We Stand, I made a supreme effort to write about the ideas and actions of people on both sides of that issue in order to explain why the people within those movements were so devoted to those ideas and worked so hard for them, and how they viewed each other. And so that was a challenge that I think that I succeeded in at least in terms of the reaction to Divided We Stand. Read it and see what you think. Anyone else have any questions? Is there a question about women's history you wish more people would ask? Oh, that's a very interesting question. I hate to come up short here, but I'm not. I think that one of the most important things for people to understand is, especially now when everyone in the U.S. in current politics is talking so much about gender and gender roles, is that there's a real confusion about biology of sexual identity and gender, and that gender is a what we call a social construct. It's a set of ideas about how men and women, boys and girls ought to act. And that, as the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead surmised from her studies of many different cultures of human beings all over the world and at different times as well as places, that these ideas are not consistent over time and that they change over time. And sometimes they change because they're socially useful to different groups. And sometimes it's a result of technological change, economic change, how people are actually making their living and supporting themselves, and what the society needs women and men to do. But that I wish that more people would question how they first got their ideas about what men and women should do, and to just generally interrogate how they came to have the ideas that they have, which gives you a lot more self-awareness and also an awareness of your ability to choose what to think for yourself. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking with you. Again, I thank you for the opportunity, and I think we have now run out of time. Thank you very much.